Payment required.
I think I'm not alone in saying that last year's Doom: The Dark Ages was not quite what I expected after 2020's Doom Eternal. Especially since with both Ancient Gods DLCs, id Software really pushed that frenetic and often exhausting push-forward combat system to its absolute threshold. Doom: The Dark Ages took a few deliberate steps back, and once again took Doom's combat in a new direction, with the introduction of a parry mechanic and much larger levels and battle arenas than anything seen before, courtesy of the new id Tech 8 engine. There was certainly a lot to love about the game. The combat was satisfying and cathartic once you got into the flow of parrying, and some of the level design was the best seen in this modern Doom trilogy, particularly the Hell levels, with lots of exploration that evoked feelings of the original games from the 90s. However, there were some parts that were a bit underwhelming, like the mech suit levels I felt were a tad gimmicky, a few levels in the middle of the campaign I thought really dragged the pacing down, and it kinda went without saying that this was probably the easiest game in the trilogy. Honestly, once you got the timing of parries down, you were humiliating cyber demons like it was nothing. Also, unless you've been studying all the lore introduced in Doom Eternal and throughout the Dark Ages, the story often felt quite convoluted for how much more emphasis the game seemed to be placing on it. Despite the Dark Ages overall being my least favourite entry in the modern era, this is still fucking Doom we're talking about, and I had a blast with it regardless, and commend id Software for not being afraid to continually reinvent the series. So I was of course curious to see what they would do with this new Revelations DLC, made unfortunately bittersweet as the release came with the announcement that more than half of the studio was laid off upon its completion. This industry really is a fucking hellscape right now, isn't it?
Your father's kingdom is broken, and your cities burn. Hell cannot be defeated.
The Revelations DLC picks up not long after the end of the main campaign, that sees the Doomslayer leading a charge into Hell to confront Hell's High Council. Here he is utterly bested by a giant demon and sent into Purgatory, where the Council obviously hopes he will meet his demise. A laughable concept considering the Slayer literally died and fought his way out of Hell as a zombie in the main campaign. The Slayer is rescued by a being simply known as the Architect, who instructs him to seek out 3 Ascension Stones to cleanse his soul and allow him to return to the mortal plane. Cue a metric shit ton of ripping and tearing. Now, while the general core of the experience is pretty much just more Doom: The Dark Ages, there are some significant changes to the game design. The DLC isn't broken up into levels from a menu anymore, instead adopting a hub world that you have to traverse around in order to reach portals leading to the 4 new levels. That gradually opens up more as you progress through the story, much like the Slayer's ship in Doom Eternal. In fact, Revelations is a lot more like Eternal than I was expecting, with mechanics and enemies, that I will vent about later, being brought back over into the main game flow. The main new weapon introduced is the Spear, which replaces the shield for a while. You're still able to parry attacks of it, albeit with new timings to learn. It also offers a bunch of new attacks that can be unlocked and upgraded. When you have the Spear equipped, you're able to perform the dash ability just like in Eternal, and use a grappling hook, much like the one attached to the Super Shotgun in Eternal, to pull yourself towards enemies or to launch you into the air to get you out of a tough spot in a battle. There are also arenas with grappling points that you can use in much the same way, particularly during the final unlockable boss fight. That gave me a fair bit of grief.
He stinks, and I don't like him.
And just like in Doom Eternal, both of these abilities are used in platforming challenges throughout the levels, particularly in the Hell Core level. The introduction of these new mechanics with the Spear is one of the most interesting parts of this DLC because of how fundamentally it shakes up everything you learnt in the main campaign. I'd heard that the DLC was significantly harder, but I still chose to carry on playing on Ultra Violence difficulty. And during the opening level on Hell when you still have the shield, I was honestly feeling pretty good about myself. Then the game took away the shield, introduced these new mechanics with the Spear, and then proceeded to fucking humble me very quickly. Yeah, Revelations does not mess around with its combat encounters, with the large scale arenas returning, and often throwing lots of the toughest enemies at you, like Barons, the Hunters, and the Cyber Demons. There's also a new variant of the Hell Knight that are quite irritating since you have to kill them pretty much immediately, otherwise they'll kamikaze themselves by exploding, which does a shit ton of damage. And it's not until you get the shield back that you're actually able to nerf them by stunning them with the saw blade. It's not quite on the same level of difficult as the Ancient Gods DLCs in Eternal, but I did still end up lowering the difficulty back down to hurt me plenty after getting my ass handed to me several times in the 3rd level.
Your position has been usurped! Usurped! You heard me!
Because Revelations brings back 2 of the most hated monsters in the series. The Pain Elemental is back and is as annoying as ever, throwing lost souls at you from a distance and now is an absolute damage sponge. Like honestly, what are they feeding these things that they can soak up so many rockets now?
Jesus! What are they feeding you?
And the fucking Archviles are back. And I just know that Hugo Martin had a massive shit-eating grin on his face when he saw how much grief these things cause now. I'm not going to break down exactly how these arseholes have been changed because I think you need to suffer first-hand as Hugo intended. But if you've played Doom before, then you know that whenever an Archvile turns up, that things are about to get pear-shaped. And the DLC just loves to throw them into the mix when you're also dealing with a Cyber Demon or an Agadon Hunter at the same time. I should also mention that the soundtrack for the DLC, once again produced by Finishing Move, is really good, and I found it a lot more memorable than the one featured in the main campaign for the Dark Ages. The music this time feels like a hybrid of the synth-heavy sound of Mick Gordon's work on Doom 2016 and Eternal, with the aggressive guitar-driven sound of the Dark Ages. There's even some fun fan service with riffs calling back to iconic Doom tracks like E1 M8. Speaking of fan service, the thing I was most excited about with this DLC was the unlockable classic levels you can play after finishing the story. These play pretty much like the classic levels from Doom 2016, with the main difference being that instead of being able to use all the weapons you'd normally find in classic Doom, you are limited to just the shotgun, which still gets the job done. And they are super fun to play through just like in Doom 2016, with the only disappointment being that there's only 4 classic maps. Honestly, I wouldn't have been mad if the DLC had just been the entirety of Doom 2 remade like this.
Captain, punch it. Punch it. Why are you not punching it?
As far as any negatives go with this DLC, for me they really only have to do with the story, which I once again just didn't really find all that interesting. I had already been spoiled about the revelation that the Slayer acquires the Praetor suit from Doom 2016, and I was hoping that maybe the ending would lead into how that original game started, but that's not really the case at all, with the ending honestly being kind of anticlimactic. And it's just a personal thing for me in that I never really liked the reveal in Doom Eternal that the Doomslayer was in fact the same Doom Marine from the original Doom games. For all of the ways in which I'm sure that the lore in the codexes tries to explain it, to me it just felt far too convoluted to make sense, and I would have preferred that Doom 2016 had remained a reboot of the story. Especially when the flashback sequences in this DLC attempt to humanize the Slayer and actually make him talk, and I don't know, it just felt kind of weird, since the Slayer, or the Marine, has always kind of been a vessel for the player to insert themselves into as you rip and tear through hordes of demons.
Hello, Detective. Is there a reason you're interrupting me mid-soup?
But honestly, the gripes I have with the story are almost a non-issue because everything else is so expertly crafted. The levels are absolutely jaw-dropping to look at, the combat is just as cathartic and chaotic, and the soundtrack absolutely rips. In light of the recent layoffs at id Software, this DLC really does feel quite bittersweet and like the end of an era with this whole modern Doom trilogy. Reports suggest that Microsoft is pushing to keep the studio focused on Doom, but honestly I'd rather that they take a break from Doom and have a go at reviving another one of their franchises, like, oh, I don't know, maybe Quake? Especially with how the art direction in the Dark Ages leaned heavily towards that Lovecraftian style horror vibe. But also, with over half their studio being gutted, I can also see how taking on a different IP could be very unfeasible at this point in time, which is such a shame to happen to such a revered and important studio as id Software. I mean, this studio practically invented first-person shooters for fuck's sake.
He ain't lying.
Ultimately, Doom the Dark Ages Revelations is worth checking out. It's an extra 10 to 12 hours of content to get through, with gameplay that brilliantly blends elements of Doom Eternal and the Dark Ages together, and proves that few studios do shooters quite like id Software do.